These sessions are continuing on. I'd like to welcome everybody to another webinar from the PSA and Visa Teaching and Learning series, and I will hand it over to Dr. Williams.
Okay, thank you very much for having me today and for the kind introduction. And again, just to reiterate my thanks for organizing this whole series. It's been great, and thanks for popping by in the middle of August to spend your time talking about statistics, which I genuinely enjoy teaching students statistics. I think it's a lot of fun and I love watching them learn more about the world. So although I gave one kind of long-winded title for the webinar, I've just gone with my simpler cover, which is I love statistics. So if at any point this kind of drops out, just pop in and let me know. So I'll just give a kind of overview of what is it that I'm doing. So what's the way that I've come from, which will be recognizable to lots of people. What's the way that I'm trying to do? What are some of the bumps I've encountered along the road, and some of the tips and tricks that I would pass on to anyone else to avoid some of those pitfalls that I've encountered. So to start off, the old way. This is how I learned statistics. I was packed into a room. It was in the basement of a building. It was 5 o'clock on a Friday. The room was quite dark. It was really overheated. And there would be someone standing at the front, click by click, demonstrating what we were supposed to do, in this case using SPSS, and that was my first encounter with statistics. And because that was the way that I was taught, that was also how I learned to teach, to stand at the front and to tell people click by click what they should do in order to produce some statistics. Now, when I learned, I feel particularly that I had no idea what I was doing, because it was one of these kind of doctoral training center modules that's given to students from a wide variety of disciplines. So there's no kind of disciplinary context of what you're doing. And I have this memory of running crosstabs between cigarette smoking and car ownership. And to this day, I have no idea what the proposed relationship was between these two variables, or why I was doing this and what this meant. But I was really good at aping whatever they were doing at the front of the room. So I came out with a first, having absolutely no idea what any of it meant. So I just thought to kind of kick things off, have a bit of a therapy session. What are some of the problems that you might have experienced with how you were taught statistics, or kind of the early issues that you faced in teaching? Maybe if you want to put that into the chat.
I can tell you my challenge when I was in my PhD was a lack of relatability. Like, it was just so different from what I was kind of wanting to apply it to that I couldn't transfer it. I couldn't understand why I was learning what I was learning. And then it was just these random data sets about the height of versus the height of boys. And it was therefore really, therefore I don't want to replicate that experience.
Yeah, and that's just it. I mean, my experience has generally been that we look at the fact that we're teaching the same skills to students, and so we pull together lots of different disciplines, and actually that makes it much harder for the students to understand what's going on. And Donna's agreed with that. The random data set is like, yeah, cigarette smoking, height, like, what is this actually teaching us about the political world? So my approach to it then has been about embedding it in the discipline. Within my department, we've tried to overhaul our comparative politics teaching so that we're focused on the scientific method as our approach. So we're looking at things where we ask a research question, then we looked at the theory in terms of what have other people already said, what are some hypotheses that we can build from that, and then look at data. So the module that I'm going to kind of use examples from today is part of a sequence that we've built, where in the first semester we introduced them to the idea of the scientific method and how this can be applied to politics. And then in the second semester, we build on that and we say, okay, now you're going to start to do your own empirical research. And then in the second year, they can carry that further and start doing inferential statistics up to logistic regression. I should say this is completely separate to the Q-step pathway. So in this pathway, we don't kind of cater to a particular approach, and it's compulsory for all of our students. So their introduction to the scientific method, we're talking about 450 students who are on that module. But it's very much about the applied statistics. It's about focusing on understanding the political world. It's about recognizing things that they're reading in the literature and then going out and being able to do some of this themselves. So kind of demystifying the research process and saying, you can actually do this. I mean, obviously not all of it, they're not going to get to Bayesian statistics, but that they can actually produce some of this stuff from week one. And it's also about trusting students to learn remotely and creating ways to self-motivate them. So a lot of times colleagues have been a bit incredulous when I've set off on my reforms, and the students live up to them. I mean, the first year module that I teach, the students invest an incredible amount of time and effort into it because they're engaged with it and they're getting to ask questions about the world that are the reason why they chose to study politics in the first place. So my philosophy is not just about applied statistics, it's really careful constructive alignment. So whilst nominally we're talking about teaching statistics online, the key, I think, is not how you teach it or where you teach it. It's about making sure that all of the different pieces of what you're teaching line up with each other, and then they lead to whatever your final assessment is. But in the meantime, we have to recognize that this is something where a lot of students feel very little confidence. So we need to have opportunities of small stakes where they can fail, and we're either assessing the learning process and their ability to reflect on what went wrong and to improve it, or that it's a summative assessment, but that it's so small that they can come back from it, that doesn't just end their module mark on that module. It's very much about hands-on learning, and it's kind of like different approaches to language learning, where some approaches to language learning, people get these long vocabulary lists and they're told how to speak with perfect grammar straight away. And then there's the opposite one, which is more immersion based, and you make tons of mistakes and you kind of learn naturally. And I go much more for the immersion based. So I don't focus on some of the finer points of assumptions of tests and things early on, because I know that a lot of the students are going to exit after a couple of semesters. And so to me, it's more important that they at least get a basic handle and that they think numbers aren't that scary and I can do things with numbers and have that sense of accomplishment. There was someone that I studied with as an undergraduate who consistently, I studied joint honors with languages, and he consistently failed in his exams. But when he was drunk, he could speak fluently. So it's about kind of raising that confidence, because there's a whole body of literature that says how you perform in statistics is more about your confidence in how you approach it than it is about any innate mathematical ability. So the example module that I'm going to talk about today is a first year undergraduate module. It's in the second semester, so it's following on from our introduction to comparative politics, where they have first encountered some of the main theories about democratic development. So the starting point from this is that we start with cultural modernization theory and post-materialism, not necessarily because I think it's the best theory, but because they've encountered it in the first semester. So they've got a bit of a familiar starting point. And we're starting with the scientific method, which they've already encountered. So we've got two familiar things, and the unfamiliar thing we're introducing is actually producing some statistics yourself. This is compulsory for all of our single honors students. Joint honors can opt in. Tends to be most popular, unsurprisingly, with politics and economics joint honors students. So we have between 200 and 250 students on this each semester. And originally I went for the online teaching for the actual statistics component simply because we didn't have enough staff to teach in computer labs for that many students. So I was asked, could you do video demonstrations and do it online? This is about 4 years ago, and I said, sure, I'll find a way. So they have an online activity every week. They also have a lecture. We've had a 1-hour seminar. COVID constraints this next year means it is going 100% online, so watch this space. I'll check back and see how that goes. And the assessment, they have 20% on weekly activities. I've said 20% online activities, but actually 5% takes the form of pop quizzes that take place in class. And that's literally just to incentivize showing up. If you're there, I give you the answer and you get the points, because being there makes a difference to your understanding. And then the online activities are kind of iteratives. They feed into the final data report. So they're practicing each of the components of what they need to do in the final assessment. They have opportunities for feedback built into it, both from myself and their peers. And then they get to the final data report. And if they've stayed on top of things along the way, there's actually not that much work left to be done writing up their data report. So I said constructive alignment is really important here. So I thought this through very carefully. My office was just a bomb site when I was planning this module, because I had things written on different colored Post-its and they were everywhere when I was trying to figure this out. So I had all the different kind of lecture topics I wanted to cover. I had all the different research design elements. And then I was sitting there on Google Scholar for hours, Googling people who had used percentages when they talked about nationalism and who also kind of fit in with this other body of literature. So there was quite a lot in the way of startup costs, but I'm very happy to share any of my resources with anyone that could help save you on that. So the lecture models the research process to them the first time round. So we introduce 1 to 3 research questions that are drawn directly from the literature that we're discussing that week. I then give them a bit of a literature review and I talk about the different theoretical explanations that people have in the literature. And then if the literature itself doesn't pose these as hypotheses, we develop our own hypotheses from that. And then we test them using data. So I'm kind of modeling the whole process to them every week. And at the same time, I'm teaching them an element of research design each week. So we talk about what makes a well-written research question. We talk about how to write a good lit review and so on. So there's kind of 2 components to every lecture. Then in the seminars, we go over questions from the lecture. We look at extracts from a particular article. I used to actually have assigned reading, but then I discovered they were putting so much effort into their reports that it was kind of unfair to ask them to do that as well compared to the credit value of the module. So instead I use extracts from the readings each week that don't assume that they've had to do preparation for that because they're already doing the online exercises. And the focus is really on understanding what you're looking at. So not looking at really high level statistics, but getting comfortable with not just skipping past a table because it has numbers in it. And also kind of building critiques and going, actually, this data visualization is awful. What could they have done better? How could they have told the story better? Or are they making certain assumptions by lumping together these answers of, you know, maybe they're pooling very good and good on a scale, and what effect does that have? And then they do the online exercises, which the ones that are about statistics, I do a video demonstration that kind of walks them through not only how to do it, but what are they actually looking at, so the interpretation of it. But we also do other things. So we have peer activities. We do a protected peer mark where it's double-blind reviewing of each other's lit review extracts. And they have to incorporate all of this into their final report. So they actually get 10% of their final report based on their reflection on their learning process. So if they knew then what they know now, what would they do differently? What have they learned from their feedback? How could their research design be improved realistically? So not, I would do 30 more countries and 15 more variables, but actually showing the thought process of research design. So this is just a quick kind of topical overview of what I do. I've experimented around with it a little bit in terms of when I do the Excel activities. So this year was the first year that I tried putting the Excel activities later so that their online assessment activities more closely mirrored the research process of doing the lit review first. But what I found was that actually demotivated the students. So in a lot of ways, dumping them in at the deep end and starting straight away with the stats in week 1 was better at getting them engaged really early. So even though that meant they ended up kind of redoing some of their work later on, I found attendance and engagement were much higher, and that's taking into account also the effect of the pandemic. So this year we ended up cutting the last 2 statistical tests because of the effect of the pandemic. So I'm going to talk through just one particular lesson to show you how I've gone about this and then open up to questions. So if I take the question, is Russia normal? Which this is a question that's drawn from the literature, but of course it's really topical. Of, you know, in the Western press, we often seem to get the impression that Russia's not behaving as we expect it to behave, that it should be behaving differently, that it's not normal. So I take the question, is Russia normal? And it's a really nice way of kind of sneaking in operationalization. What does normal mean? How do we measure normal? How do we know normal when we see it? And talk about statistical normalcy, but also talking about, well, it depends on who you compare it to. So your case selection matters when you're talking about normal. So we talk about, well, normal, we're probably looking at it compared to the G8, but actually, if you compare Russia to other post-Soviet states who had similar starting points in about 1990, talking particularly about democratization and political participation, actually from that perspective, they're performing as expected. So that this idea of operationalization and the idea of normal, we can kind of dissect it by using this case. So then we talk about levels of measurement and how to identify appropriate variables, and then that leads us to looking at correlation and mirroring a piece of literature that we're looking at where they look at correlates of satisfaction with democracy in Russia. And we can use the data to create an up-to-date comparison. So we're looking at an article that was published in about 2011. So they can do an update with more recent wave of data and compare, okay, what's happened since then. So when they get to the online element of that, they get a kind of introduction to the statistical concept. Then they have the actual how-to of how do I produce a correlation. This module uses Excel just because it's a good life skill, not because it's wonderful for doing statistics. It's a pain in the backside. But it's a good employable skill, and quite a few students have said that they actually used it straight away in summer placements and things because they then knew their way around it. They then have a bank of practice quiz questions that they can attempt. So they manipulate the data. They usually have to compare something that they've produced to pre-existing research or to another country. So it's not just producing a statistic, but actually trying to understand what does this mean. And then they've got the assessed quiz questions. So in this case, it was just 3 questions about kind of variable pairings and choosing the right test. Let's see. So it just says, okay, here's a couple of variables from the data set, which means they then have to go and look at the data set, look at the answer options, and figure out, okay, if I'm going to use these 2 variables with each other, what would the appropriate test for that be. Then a really straightforward one about interpreting correlation coefficients, where it just gives them a series of coefficients, and then one where they have to go and produce a series of correlations themselves. Now, I said it was only 3 questions, but actually you may have noticed there's quite a lot of work involved in completing each of those 3 questions. All of this is through Moodle, so it's different question types that I've got built into here. And that means that when I was talking to them, they're spending an average between 1 and 2 hours doing these, which is why I cut out the required reading, because you add that onto their data reports as well, and that's actually quite a bit of work that they're doing. So some of the bumps along the road. As I mentioned already, the timing of activities really affects the motivation. So on the one hand, I have some headaches with starting straight away with Excel when I have late joiners. So even though this is the spring, we sometimes get people who are coming in on exchange or who are opting into the module because it's one of their constrained choices and they change their mind. So I've got some students who are coming in like 2 weeks behind everybody else. But having experienced this year where we put Excel later, actually the motivation was a lot higher with having it earlier, and I'm going to go back to having it straight from the beginning and kind of dump them in the deep end. They start working really hard and you kind of establish that this is how we do things. Academic integrity was definitely the biggest issue for me with teaching this online. So originally I tried to be nice to them and I let them work in groups. And what we found is, funnily enough, 100% of the cohort were getting the answers right, because they were posting all the answers online and putting them on kind of Snapchat and whatever that I couldn't see them. So I then had to change it so it has question randomization. So for every question that gets asked, there are 10 versions of it that use a different country or change out different variables. So obviously creating that bank of questions was a substantial amount of work, but it did solve a lot of the academic integrity problems, because the number of permutations you would get, even if they shared some of the answers online, with this number of students, it'd be very hard for them to get all of the answers. And accessibility, I think, is the thing you really have to highlight with moving to things online. So I had a student 2 years ago who is fully blind, and that meant I really had to think through how I narrated the videos, that I was always talking through entirely everything that I was doing, not just as you can see I'm doing here, but actually naming what I'm clicking on and what happens when I click on that thing. But that's not the only one. Obviously, teaching online can also have impacts on people with hearing impairments. So making sure that it's accompanied by transcript. There's reasonable auto transcripts out there now, and YouTube will also produce them, and then you can edit them afterwards to kind of make them a bit better. The other things with accessibility, one of my colleagues brought to our attention frequently the amount that data visualization is not colorblind friendly. So originally I would just produce stuff and I wouldn't stop to think that 1 in 8 of my students actually can't see the difference between the lines in my line graphs. So making sure that I'm using symbols on line graphs, that I'm using pattern fills and things when I'm producing bar charts, and also expecting students to do this. So bringing this to students' attention. So I don't suffer from color blindness myself, but it's probably a good habit to be in with producing things in a professional environment, to start actually thinking through, is what I'm producing in an accessible format that people with various different needs will be able to access. So then the tips and tricks. I would say the continuous iterative assessment for me was key. That 20% makes such a huge difference in their behavior and the way that they stay on top of the work. I varied the amount that the statistics element was worth over the course of a few years, and I think we've come to a happy medium with it being worth about 10% of the module. So it was enough that they actually do it on a regular basis, but it's low stakes enough that they can mess it up and it's not going to have a disproportionate impact. But the peer-to-peer interactions are also really important. So I do still tell them that they're welcome to work together, but obviously with the question randomization, they're not likely to face the same questions in the quiz. So they can still form peer support communities where they're helping each other with the techniques and less with just passing around the answers. But we do also do quite a few peer activities of like the peer marking of the lit reviews and kind of applying the marking criteria to some past student work and things. Producing good materials has had a lasting impact and spillover effects because it's allowed students to revisit the materials in a way that they can't when it's done in a computer lab, unless it's recorded. So what we found is that students are going back to them when they're doing their dissertations or when they're doing something in a different year where those skills suddenly become relevant again, that they're able to revisit those materials, and that has a really positive spillover effect. So we found that, what was it, more than a third of our dissertation students this year included some sort of quantitative element in their dissertations, which is up from fewer than 1 in 10. And we have about 50% more people doing a dissertation now than they were 5 years ago compared to the cohort size, because we have optional dissertations, so not everybody does it. But I also provide the materials in various formats, which again is a lot of startup work but has payoff. So I have quick reference guides because some of the students have already done Excel before. They don't want to sit through a half-hour video where I'm narrating the blow by blow. All they want is a quick reminder of what they have to do. And that helps them keep more engaged. So I continue to give the messaging of these things are here to help you. That doesn't mean that I am going to sit there and make sure that you watch every video. You do what you need to do in order to get the end result. So that's just some screenshots of some of the materials I provide. So they have an Excel quick reference guide, for example, that also shows them the steps of this is what raw data looks like, this is what professionally formatted data looks like and how to do it. But they also have lots of examples of other students' work, so not just like this is what it looks like when well-qualified academics are doing things, but actually this is what it looks like for students to produce original research. And then a tiny plug about my book for anyone who would find this useful. The whole reason I wrote this book was because I was frustrated with the lack of politics-specific stats teaching stuff out there. Ironically, I don't actually teach SPSS at the moment, but it also teaches them syntax alongside venues and trying to get students into syntax straight away. So my publishers wanted me to make sure that you know it's out there. Yeah, so opening up to questions, comments, I'd be happy to give you a little tour of my Moodle page if that would be useful, but kind of take the conversation wherever you'd like it to go.
Well, thank you very much for that. That was really, really interesting. Bring up the chat function, so if people want to start putting some questions into the chat, I can feel those. As I wait for those to come in, I've got a couple of comments, and I thought it was really interesting. And I think going back to my problem, what I found really what you said was telling a better story. I think that is sometimes in stats, like it's stats for stats' sake. Like we have at my university a year 2 module that if they have to do, it's core, but they just have to do it. And so it's not ever like, it's just you've got to learn the math. You don't ever learn that how it tells that better story. And so I thought that was really, it's that situating, it's that kind of positioning, I think, makes it more relevant for students. So I really enjoyed that. So my question is kind of connected to that. My question is, you talked about like aligning it within the module, but do you think about aligning it within their degrees with other modules that they do across their whole degree? And how do you manage that with other teams of staff and colleagues?
Yeah, so we have worked really hard to have alignment between different modules. So I aligned myself with Intro to Comp Whole. And then I have a colleague who teaches using SPSS in the second year, and they start from the content that the students have learned on my module, and we explicitly coordinate with each other of what are you teaching, and then bring those examples in so that the students, you don't want to introduce too many different elements all at the same time. So often when we teach statistics, it's a new computer program, it's new maths, and it's new topics. And all three of those things are completely alien to them. So instead we're trying to take out 2 out of 3 of those so they recognize the topics that we're doing. We're kind of easing them into the statistics, and it's just, okay, here's a new computer environment in which we're going to learn these things.
So kind of on the back of that, you've talked about Excel today, but you've SPSS. At the level you're teaching, why not SPSS?
Sorry, you cut out there.
Why have you chosen Excel over SPSS?
Oh, Excel was 100% about employability.
Oh, right, okay.
It made so much more work for me because I translated the world and European values data sets into Excel. and then I formatted them after the fact so that they would work better with how Excel thinks about data, which is a huge amount of extra work. But it was 100% from the perspective of, if this is their exit point and they do no more statistics after this, they're more likely to use this than they are to use SPSS. So almost any office environment, they'll probably have to open Excel at some point. That's
really interesting, isn't it? Because I think, again, we teach SPSS because that's what stats is done on, but actually in practice, people don't use SPSS unless you're going in with statistics. They use Excel. I think that's so, that it sounds quite a simple thing, doesn't it? But it's a really important thing, I think, that distinction and that forethought. Are there any questions from our kind of viewers? You can speak up, raise your hand, or put it in chat, or I will in the conversation.
I would say as well, we don't focus on the inferential statistics on this module. So correlation is the only inferential statistic that we do. Everything else is just descriptive statistics. So let's just describe what's going on here, but we're not going to make any conclusions about statistical significance and all of that. Yeah, so the data sets, yeah, so I have the World and European Values Surveys integrated longitudinal data set. And then I produce that into Excel format, split down by country, because if you just translate that into Excel, it's a gigabyte and Excel hates you. So it's split out by country, which does limit what students can do with it in terms of their research projects. So they're usually limited to a comparison of maximum of 3 countries, just because after that they're having to produce every table in every single data set. But in terms of like what they can learn from it, I went with that data set because it plugged into talking about cultural modernization theory and all of Engelhardt and Norris's work. So there's a huge body of literature, whether or not you agree with it, but there's lots of literature that they can find that uses this data. So it makes data replication a lot easier. Yeah, we also thought about student access for working on their own devices, because we were thinking this isn't going to be in computer labs, so it has to be something the students can run on their own devices. At the time, I'm not sure that we had an off-campus license for everyone to do SPSS. We could have arranged it if I was really determined, but Excel, most students already have it installed, and if they don't, we have an institutional subscription. So there was no additional cost to students for using Excel. Yeah, I mean, they can use the freeware versions, and most of them will work in exactly the same way. And in fact, they can follow pretty much the same menus and it will work as well. We didn't, just because Excel is supported by our university license. That makes it's sometimes a bit more stable working with the really large data files and pivot tables. But I do know that some of our students have used the freeware to produce their projects, and that's fine. They don't get penalized for it.
Can I ask a question about your continuous assessment? I think this is something we're looking at, not just like across the board, like reading memos type stuff. Can you tell me more about how you've used it and how it's the good things to do, but also the things to avoid doing?
So for me, the key with continuous assessment is that it has to be iterative. So it has to be linked to the final big piece of assessment. Otherwise, you're just making work. So every piece that they do along the way will make their final report easier. So we always hammer on at them about appropriate referencing in the first year. And in the first semester, they have an academic skills module, and loads of them fail the referencing element. So we revisit that, and they have to produce a draft bibliography a few weeks in. And they get marked on the referencing, but actually in the meantime, they're making a reading list for themselves that's going to be in their data report. And they're getting feedback on their referencing skills, as well as their preliminary research question, which they type at the top. So each of these is feeding into different sections. They do this lit review draft where they get feedback from their tutor, but also from their peers. And that, you know, if they do well in that, they can literally just copy and paste it into their final report. Continuous assessment, where it's making extra work, and each piece of assessment is not connected, but you're just trying to make them do work every week, I'm not such a fan of. Because I think we tend to forget the amount of time they spend doing that.
No, I completely, that makes complete sense. I think that's something, when we looked at it, it was around attendance, to encourage attendance, rather than the pedagogical justification, which, you know, actually builds into a bigger piece of work. So actually you're learning and then you're kind of constructing at the end. How have you found, like, providing feedback on that continuous assessment? Has it been too onerous on you or the team, or?
Most of it's pre-programmed. So all of the Excel quizzes, I had the startup costs of building them, which I'm not going to lie, was probably around 100 hours of time. But that was 100 hours 4 years ago.
Yeah.
And now, like, the bank just ticks over from year to year. Sometimes I throw in a couple of new countries just to make sure that the answers aren't all out on the internet somewhere. I think the only thing where there's an onus on me for marking is the lit review feedback. And for that, they literally just get clicks on marking criteria. So click the box of how they did, and a preliminary mark to give them an indication of how they would do if they submitted this in their final project. So I'm spending like 5, maximum 10 minutes on these, because it's 200, 300 words. It's very short. And I think that's really important, is to think about how you can build this in a way that they're still meaningfully learning from it, but without introducing new work for yourself. So there's a question about how we're planning to run seminars online this year. We're not. Not for this module, because this is only a 10 credit module, and we simply don't have the staff to run seminars for 10 credit modules. So it's going to be really challenging. We'll have lecture engagement sessions where the students will have the opportunity to ask questions, but a lot of it is going to be, again, pre-designing these activities and then chasing students. So a lot of what I do as the module convener is mail merging, another Excel skill. I mail merge them and harass the life out of them. Like every 2 weeks, I mail merge them. I'm like, I've noticed that you've performed X so far, or you've missed this and that. And, you know, if there's any welfare concerns, please raise them now, which does always flush out some students that we're not aware of. So that sentence when I'm chasing them is always really important. But because you can't tell the difference of someone writing a personal email and someone mail merging you when you have specific data like that downloaded from Moodle, it tends to evoke a response, and you'll get an immediate uptick in their engagement with the module because they don't know whether I've actually monitored what they're doing. So I think it's going to be a lot of that this year, but it will be an experiment to see what the results of that look like. I'm also changing the assessment because I won't have staff to support me at all on this. So it's going to be a research portfolio, which they can assemble from the different things that they do across the weeks. They can do it as a kind of poster presentation. Basically just prove to me that you've established the skills. So you don't have to write a coherent 1,500 word report for me, but more just demonstrate that you've met the learning outcomes. But we'll see how that goes. So John said, did we make a conscious decision to promote a scientific approach? Has this helped engage students in stats? Yes and yes. So we make it really clear to the students from the start how the different modules that they're taking fit in with different sub-disciplines. And we use that language. So we say this is a comparative politics module, which means we approach things differently to political theory. And not saying that stats is better, so we're not saying that we're all empiricists, but more to highlight to them. That means we have different expectations of how you use evidence, different expectations of your argument, your use of literature, and kind of inducting them into, there are different subdisciplines within politics and IR, and this has an impact on how we use data about the world. So we made the decision to promote the scientific approach based on this colleague's work on intro to comparative politics in the first semester, where she was introducing this, and we thought this is really successful. How can we build on this? And so we're using that same cycle for a series of modules where we walk them through until they can do it in their sleep, of going research question, theory, hypotheses, data, and that this is no longer at all alien to them. The fact that we start this in the first semester, we've had a massive decrease in resistance to stats. So we used to start, like I think many people, in the fourth semester of their degree. So you'd get to the second semester of the second year, and by then they have very fixed ideas of what constitutes studying politics. And it often does not include studying stats. We found that by kind of mainstreaming this, of this is the language that we use as one way of studying the discipline, that we get a lot of students who are opting to do more of it. So we have about a 50% conversion rate from taking my compulsory module to electing to take more stats in their second year. And as I mentioned, more than a third of our students are now having some quantitative element in their dissertations.
With the move online, what's your, I shouldn't say problem, what's your biggest challenge? What's your biggest fear?
Yeah, it's about that kind of the opportunity to check in with students on an individual basis. Because normally what I would do in the seminars is I would essentially give them mini supervision within the seminar. So I would set a kind of wider task, and then I'd work my way around the room and have a quick chat with each person. How's your project going? What are you thinking about? And kind of troubleshooting when I can see that that's going to lead to a dead end in terms of availability of data or variables or whatever. So I'm going to lose that this year. And I think that's going to be really difficult. And I think that's going to have to be incorporated into the activities in some way of just giving me some sort of progress check. Where are you at? What are you thinking? And kind of providing a bit of an opportunity for them to ask questions.
It seems to be a common theme over all these webinars we've been having. Everyone's, surrounding like how do you get flow going into a class, how do you react to like non-verbal cues, and how do you check in, and there's a lot of welfare issues and that, as well as academic issues, things you notice in the classroom that you just can't notice when they've got their camera off, or it makes interventions very difficult. And I know a lot of, and that seems to be like a common fear and theme that's come up over these past few weeks, is losing that detachment from students. I think it's an important concern, and kind of building a student community. I think my kind of, as DLT of my department, student community is going to be a huge challenge, and stats is one of those things that actually students bond over one way or another. Loving it, often they bond and they share, and you go lose all of that. And I think that is a big challenge, I think, especially for a module like this.
Yeah, I think my virtual harassment of them will be important.
But I think that is important, because I think, when we start our personal tutor meetings, we use mail merge, and it's the same sort of thing. It makes them feel that they're not just a number, that they are a name and identity. And it's a bit of a cheat from our point of view. It actually has a very important role in kind of encouraging and engaging, and it forms a connection. So I do think it is really important. Hannah's not very good at mail merge.
Yeah, I'm interested to see how it affects some of the negative classroom dynamics that we sometimes have. So it's very clear sometimes that students in particular groups have lower attendance rates. And some of that, I think, arises from microaggressions that they experience from other students. And so I'm kind of wondering whether those students might have a better time of it this year, but we'll see.
That's interesting, because like students quite often, like moods are infectious, aren't they? And attitudes are infectious. And if you're not careful, someone who's struggling will very easily put other people off as a whole. And I think that surrounds that kind of rhetoric that surrounds statistics as being hard because it's maths, and and I can't do it, and then that very quickly bleeds into other people's perception. As you said before, confidence. I think that's then really important. So it might be interesting. Yeah, you're right. I think that'll be really interesting to see how confidence is impacted. Are there any more questions from the field? If not, I will wrap us up. I would like to thank Dr. Williams for joining us. In case it isn't clear to everybody, I am not a statistician, I'm an ethicist, but of teaching, and it's been an interesting talk to kind of hear the same sort of conversations that I am having with myself, with my colleagues around teaching. They're happening everywhere around kind of connecting, continuous assessment, telling that political story, accessibility, employability. I thought that was a really interesting point. Checking in that welfare aspect of academia, that it's really hard to kind of pin down, but we actually need to kind of include everything we do, linking up across modules and across programs, and academic integrity. So these are all concerns for every module we teach, and I think hearing it from kind of your point of view was really, really interesting to me. So I would like to offer a personal thank you to you today, and I would say, you know, everyone has enjoyed the talk. It will be online shortly, I hope. And if there's any final words from you, Helen?
No, but if you have any questions or you'd like to see my materials, I'm always happy to share.
That's brilliant. Well, I'd like to thank everybody for attending today. I hope you all stay happy and healthy, and we'll see you all again soon. Thank you. Goodbye.